The studio lights flared to life like the rising sun before a storm. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that grips audiences when they sense something irreversible is about to unfold. Cameras panned across a restless crowd, their murmurs a low hum beneath the buzz of the nation's most talked-about broadcast. Pam Bondi, the seasoned prosecutor turned political commentator, adjusted her papers with deliberate precision. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the set where Jasmine Crockett, the fiery Congresswoman from Texas, was already seated, her calm presence disarming, her expression unreadable. The two women had faced off before. Their previous encounter had gone viral, a chaotic mix of sharp intellect, sarcasm, and dominance. Pam had tried to corner Crockett with legal traps. Crockett, unshaken, had turned those traps into stepping stones for one of the most replayed exchanges on political television. And now, they were back, again. The host's voice broke through the tension. Tonight, America witnesses a rematch. Two powerful women, two opposing forces. Pam Bondi and Representative Jasmine Crockett, live, unfiltered, and uncut. Applause erupted, but beneath the clapping hands lay divided hearts. One side admired Bondi's composure, the other revered Crockett's fire. Both women represented not just themselves, but two ideological worlds clashing head-on. Pam began with a smile, that polished, political smile of someone who knows how to charm before striking. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her tone velvet but her intent steel. "The American people have seen your performances before, loud, emotional, even entertaining. But when it comes to facts and the law, I'm afraid theatrics don't hold much weight." The audience reacted. A mix of gasps and laughter. Crockett leaned back in her chair, the faintest smirk playing at the corner of her lips. She didn't rush to reply, she let silence become her ally. "Pam," Crockett began, her voice steady as marble. "The last time we spoke, you tried to twist facts like they were pieces of soft clay. But this isn't a courtroom you can control. It's a platform where truth isn't afraid to speak back." Bondi straightened. "Truth," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Congresswoman, you've built your brand on emotional outbursts and partisan talking points. The people watching deserve facts, not feelings." Crockett's eyes glimmered, and for a moment, it was as if the entire room leaned closer, anticipating the rebuttal. "Oh, facts," she said softly. "Let's talk facts. Fact, you were one of the leading defenders of a president impeached twice. Fact, you went on national television and called investigations a witch hunt. And fact, when women like me demand accountability, suddenly we're called emotional." Her tone cut like a blade wrapped in silk. Pam Bondi tried to interject, but Crockett's momentum was unstoppable. "You want to talk about theatrics," Crockett continued. "I've watched you turn press briefings into stage performances. I've watched you defend corruption with a straight face. But when I raise my voice for justice, it's suddenly a show." The crowd erupted, some clapping, others jeering. The host leaned in, sensing the moment swell like a tidal wave. Bondi forced a laugh. "You're doing it again, Congresswoman. Dodging questions with emotion. You can't prosecute me with passion." Crockett turned her head slightly, her tone dropping to that quiet, surgical calm that often preceded her most devastating blows. "Oh, I'm not prosecuting you, Pam," she said. "You already did that to yourself the moment you traded law for propaganda." The room went still. Even the host paused, as if the air itself had frozen. Pam's expression hardened. Gone was the practiced media smile. "That's a bold statement from someone who's made a career out of blaming everyone else for America's problems." Crockett's reply was immediate, deliberate. "I don't blame everyone, Pam. I just don't let people hide behind power while pretending to protect it. You call me emotional because I care, because I'm not numb to injustice. But maybe the real problem is that somewhere along the line, you stopped caring at all." The studio was silent. For the first time, Bondi's eyes flickered, a flash of something between anger and realization. The camera zoomed in, capturing every twitch, every wordless tremor between them. The host tried to redirect. "Let's bring this back to policy, to the legal questions surrounding government oversight." But the conversation had already outgrown the topic. This was no longer about law, it was about legacy. Pam Bondi leaned forward, reclaiming her composure. "You think passion wins debates, Congresswoman, but passion fades. Facts endure." Crockett smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure those facts see the light of day." And with that, she began citing records, reports, and legal filings, each one a precise nail hammered into the argument's coffin. She quoted timelines, testimonies, and judicial statements, not as a politician performing, but as a lawyer building a case. Pam tried to counter, but each rebuttal sounded thinner, less certain. The balance of the room shifted. By the time Crockett finished, the crowd wasn't clapping. They were simply watching, silent, aware that something irreversible had happened. Pam Bondi sat back, eyes on her notes, but they no longer anchored her. Crockett's voice softened, almost empathetic now. Pam, you came here thinking you could corner me again. But maybe the truth is, you built the corner, and then walked into it yourself. The final line hung in the air like a closing gavel. The host, unsure how to move forward, cleared his throat. Well, take a quick break, he said awkwardly, and return for part 2 of this heated exchange. The cameras faded to black, but the moment, that unmistakable reversal of power, lingered far longer than the broadcast. Pam Bondi had come to corner Jasmine Crockett again. But this time, it wasn't just a debate, it was the beginning of an ending, live, on air, and unmistakably final. The break was brief, but the tension in the studio never broke. Even the crew whispered quietly as they rearranged the stage for the next segment. Cameras refocused, lights dimmed just enough to cast dramatic shadows across the faces of the two women now locked in silent rivalry. Pam Bondi sat forward, her expression reconstructed, no longer rattled, but sharpened with a prosecutor's precision. Her hands rested atop her notes like a general's on a war map. She had come prepared for battle, and though the first round had clearly gone to Jasmine Crockett, Bondi wasn't known for surrender. When the host returned on camera, his tone was diplomatic, careful. Welcome back. Before the break, things got heated. Let's return to substance. Tonight's topic: political accountability, integrity in leadership, and the public trust. Pam Bondi wasted no time. Integrity, she said, almost tasting the word. That's exactly where we need to begin. Congresswoman Crockett likes to talk about accountability, but when it comes to her own party's hypocrisy, she suddenly forgets what that word means. Her voice was calm, but her words dripped with venom masked as logic. Let's talk about your selective outrage, Bondi continued. You demand investigations into everyone who doesn't share your ideology. But where are your calls for transparency when corruption happens under your watch? Where's that same fire then? A few murmurs rippled through the audience. The accusation hung in the air, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Crockett didn't flinch. She folded her hands, her demeanor measured, the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered storms worse than this. You know, Pam, she said softly, the difference between us isn't that one of us calls for justice and the other doesn't. The difference is that I call for it even when it's uncomfortable. You call for it only when it's convenient. Bondi smirked, leaning closer to the microphone. Convenient. I spent years in courtrooms fighting for victims, defending law and order. I don't need lectures about justice from someone who turned a committee hearing into a personal vendetta. Crockett tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady. You fought for law and order, she repeated. But somewhere along the way you started defending power instead of people. There's a difference. The words hit like a cold wind. Pam's jaw tightened. That's an easy line for television, Congresswoman. But out here in the real world, we deal in facts, not feelings. Crockett's smile was small but dangerous. Then let's deal in facts. She reached for the tablet in front of her, swiping the screen as if flipping through a case file. Fact: you went on national television to defend misconduct that even members of your own party condemned. Fact: you've attacked investigations that exposed clear violations of ethics. And fact: every time accountability came for those you supported, you called it political theater. Bondi interrupted sharply. That's not fair. You're twisting events, taking selective sound bites. Crockett's voice rose just enough to reclaim the space. Pam, I'm quoting your own words. I didn't twist them. You did. When the crowd stirred, a mix of gasps and half laughter, Pam Bondi exhaled slowly, visibly fighting to regain composure. You know what this is, Congresswoman. This is performance politics. You stand here pretending to care about ethics, but you thrive on outrage. The louder the headline, the more you win. Crockett leaned forward, her gaze sharp, unwavering. And you thrive on denial. The quieter the truth, the easier it is to bury. But some of us refuse to let it stay buried. There it was. The rhythm, the energy, the courtroom cadence that made Jasmine Crockett's speeches impossible to ignore. Her tone was no longer just defensive. It was surgical, dissecting the hypocrisy line by line. Bondi tried again. Do you even hear yourself? You're attacking me because I believe in due process. Due process? Crockett interrupted, her voice slicing through the air. Isn't a shield for the powerful, Pam. It's supposed to protect the powerless. You invoke it when it benefits your allies, but you abandon it when it's women, minorities, or the voiceless asking for justice. The studio fell silent. The host glanced toward the control booth, where producers were signaling to keep rolling. The tension was too compelling to cut away from. Pam Bondi blinked, her tone hardening into defense. You want to paint me as heartless because it makes good television. But I've stood in front of victims. I've cried with families. Don't you dare question my compassion. Crockett's reply was immediate, calm, not cold. I'm not questioning your past, Pam. I'm questioning your present. Because somewhere between those courtrooms and these cameras, something changed. You stopped listening to pain, and started defending privilege. Bondi looked away for a brief second, but Crockett didn't stop. She continued, each word deliberate, each phrase precise. You can't stand on the side of justice only when it flatters you. Integrity isn't situational. It's supposed to be constant. Especially when the cameras are off. The crowd broke into applause. Not thunderous but steady, like a wave of agreement spreading across the room. Pam Bondi waited, her eyes scanning the audience before turning back to Crockett. You're good at this, she said bitterly. You know how to turn a debate into a sermon. But sermons don't change laws. Crockett smiled unbothered. No, Pam, but they change hearts. And hearts make the laws worth following. The exchange had become more than debate. It was a clash of two worldviews, restraint versus righteousness, image versus conviction. The host, sensing the emotional pitch, stepped in carefully. Let's not lose focus. The question is about accountability and governance. Where do each of you believe the system has failed? Pam Bondi took a breath, reclaiming the floor. The system fails, she said, when politicians grandstand instead of governing. When they'd rather go viral than solve problems. Crockett responded without missing a beat. And it fails, she countered, when those in power pretend that silence equals civility. When corruption hides behind polite smiles and press releases. Pam's eyes narrowed. You call me part of the problem. But what exactly have you fixed? Crockett leaned in, her tone soft but deadly. Sometimes fixing things means calling them what they are, even when it makes people uncomfortable. That's leadership. That's truth. A long pause followed, not awkward, but heavy with meaning. Bondi finally spoke, her voice low. You think you ended me tonight, Congresswoman? But remember, outrage fades. I'll still be here when the lights go off. Crockett met her gaze without hesitation. Maybe. But when they do, the truth will still be shining. And that's something even the cameras can't turn off. The host's voice trembled slightly as he cut in. We'll be right back after the break. And in our next segment, both guests will respond to audience questions. As the camera panned away, the two women stayed locked in silence, not enemies but symbols of the war within modern politics. Pam Bondi had struck back hard. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended, she had dismantled. And the night was only halfway through. The audience was no longer just an audience, they had become witnesses. The stage lights cast long, cinematic shadows, the kind that seemed to stretch over the entire country. Millions were watching live, waiting to see who would emerge from this verbal battleground with their reputation intact. The host's voice echoed across the studio as the applause faded. One now opened the floor to audience questions, he announced. Real Americans with real concerns, to both of our guests. The first hand rose from the crowd, a middle-aged woman, calm but firm, her voice cutting through the air with the confidence of someone who had seen enough political theater to know the difference between truth and spin. My question is for both of you, she said. Why do so many politicians, on both sides, talk about integrity but fail to live it? Isn't it all just performance at this point? The crowd murmured, nodding, some clapping. It was the question that lingered beneath every debate, every scandal, every headline. Pam Bondi was quick to respond. That's a fair question, she said, her tone softened now, rehearsed but human. Public service is about sacrifice. But too often, that gets twisted into self-promotion. I've worked with people who entered politics to serve, and I've seen others come for fame. We have to get back to the basics. Truth, discipline, and respect. Her words were smooth, almost too smooth, like marble polish to hide the cracks beneath. Then Jasmine Crockett spoke. "You're right to ask that," she began, her tone quieter but more grounded. "Because politics has become a stage, not a service. The truth is, too many people think power is a crown. But it's supposed to be a responsibility. You don't wear it, you carry it, and if you drop it, people get hurt." Her words didn't sound like talking points. They sounded like truth spoken from the gut. The crowd responded instantly, applause rising like a wave. Pam forced a smile, but the tension in her jaw was visible. The next question came from a young man in the back row. "Ms. Bondi," he said carefully, "you've been criticized for defending figures accused of misconduct. How do you reconcile that with your calls for integrity tonight?" The question hit like a thunderclap. Even the host seemed momentarily unsure if he should intervene. Pam's expression flickered, just for a second, before she steadied herself. "Everyone deserves a defense," she said firmly. "That's the foundation of our justice system. You can't claim to stand for fairness and then deny it to people just because you dislike them." Crockett nodded slightly, acknowledging the point. Then struck. "You're right," she said smoothly. "Everyone deserves a defense. But not everyone deserves a defense that distorts the truth. The law is about justice, not loyalty to whoever signs the paycheck." The words landed like a clean strike. The audience gasped, and for the first time that night Pam Bondi visibly faltered. She tried to respond, but Crockett pressed forward, her tone still calm, but her precision merciless. "You know, Pam," she said, "you've defended many powerful people. That's your right. But the moment you stepped into the media and started defending the same behavior you once prosecuted, that wasn't justice anymore. That was self-preservation disguised as principle." The studio went quiet. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Pam blinked, her jaw tightening. "That's a cheap shot, Congresswoman." Crockett's tone softened. "No, it's an honest one." The host interjected quickly, sensing the rising temperature. "Let's move to the next question." A college student stood up, nervous but determined. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, "you're known for being outspoken. Some say you're too confrontational, that you make it personal. Do you think that hurts your cause?" Crockett smiled faintly. "That's a question I get a lot," she said. "And I'll be honest, it used to bother me. Because when a woman raises her voice, it's called emotional. When a man does it, it's called leadership. I speak up because silence protects power, and I refuse to be part of that silence." The crowd erupted in applause, loud, sustained, echoing beyond the walls of the studio. Pam Bondi leaned forward, her tone clipped. "No one's saying you shouldn't speak up. But there's a difference between speaking truth and attacking people who disagree with you." Crockett turned her head slightly. "And there's a difference between disagreement and dishonesty. I don't attack people, Pam. I confront hypocrisy. That's not hostility, that's honesty with a spine." The words sliced through the noise. Bondi tried to regain footing. "But you assume moral superiority every time. You act like anyone who disagrees with you lacks integrity." Crockett didn't blink. "I don't assume moral superiority, Pam. I just don't pretend neutrality when I see injustice. If that makes me passionate, I'll wear that label proudly." The room fell into that rare kind of silence where everyone was listening, not to react, but to absorb. Pam Bondi shifted her papers, her hands trembling slightly. "You're good at theater, Congresswoman," she said, voice lower now. "But I've seen too many politicians with pretty speeches and empty results." Crockett replied without hesitation. "Then maybe the problem isn't the speeches, it's the people who ignore them." A ripple of applause. A few cheers. The host raised a hand for quiet, but the energy in the room was alive, electric. Pam leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, as Crockett continued, now less adversarial, more reflective. "You know what's funny?" Crockett said. "People call this a debate. But I'm not here to score points. I'm here to remind people that integrity doesn't depend on political color. It depends on courage. And courage is doing what's right even when your allies tell you to stay quiet." Pam said nothing. Her eyes dropped to the table, the weight of Crockett's words settling like dust after a storm. The host cleared his throat. "Final audience question," he announced. "And it's one for both of you." An older man stood, his voice gravelly, his presence commanding. "Do you two actually believe what you're saying tonight? Or is this just another episode of Who Can Talk Louder on TV?" The question disarmed the stage. Pam answered first, her tone defensive but sincere. "I believe every word," she said, because this country needs people who stand firm even when it's unpopular. Crockett waited, then responded quietly. I believe every word too, but belief without truth is just noise, and this country already has enough noise. That line landed hard. Even Pam couldn't immediately respond. The host hesitated, then turned toward the camera. We'll return after this short break for final statements from both guests. As the lights dimmed, the camera lingered on the two women. Bondi staring down at her notes, Crockett looking straight ahead, calm, collected, ready. It wasn't over, not yet. But as the break music played, it was clear to everyone watching Pam Bondi was fighting to stay afloat, and Jasmine Crockett was writing the narrative in real time. The battle lines were drawn. The final round was about to begin. The final segment began not with fanfare but with a hush, the kind that falls before a verdict. The studio lights dimmed to a warmer glow, giving the set the feel of a courtroom at dusk. Both women sat still, framed side by side under the national flag. The host exhaled audibly, glancing between them. We're down to closing statements. Each of you will have 2 minutes, uninterrupted. But everyone knew it would be more than that. Pam Bondi straightened, smoothing the edges of her notes as if the motion itself could restore control. She looked into the camera with the practiced poise of someone who had survived countless interviews, hearings and headlines. Tonight, she began, we've heard a lot of noise, accusations, emotion, division. But when the shouting stops, facts still matter. I've spent my career defending justice, not politics. And I'll never apologize for believing that our laws should rise above ideology. I respect Congresswoman Crockett's passion. But passion without principle leads to chaos. The law must be reason, not rage. It was a polished, close, almost elegant. She placed her papers down with deliberate care, lips forming a faint, self-assured smile. Then it was Jasmine Crockett's turn. She didn't reach for her notes. She simply looked across the table, not at the camera, but at Pam Bondi. And when she finally spoke, her tone was steady, almost gentle. You said the law must be reason, not rage, she said quietly. But reason without humanity becomes machinery, and justice without empathy becomes cruelty with a legal name. The words hung there, fragile yet immovable. Crockett continued, her eyes never leaving Bondi's. You talk about chaos, Pam, but chaos doesn't start when people demand accountability. Chaos starts when power stops listening. When the truth is buried under strategy. When law becomes a weapon instead of a shield. The audience leaned forward, silent, caught in the gravity of her cadence. I became a lawyer, Crockett went on, because I believed justice was blind. But somewhere along the way, I realized it's not blind, it's just often looking in the wrong direction. Toward the powerful, the privileged, the comfortable. You and I both know that. You've seen it up close. Pam Bondi's composure wavered. For the first time all night, she looked uncertain. Crockett softened her tone further, almost compassionate now. Pam, I'm not your enemy. I don't want to end you. I want you to remember why you started, why any of us started. Because justice isn't a career. It's a calling. And somewhere between the courtrooms and the cameras, we both forgot that. Bondi blinked, her throat tightening. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Crockett turned toward the camera now, her gaze firm, her voice rising just enough to fill the room. To everyone watching, she said, don't let politics turn your conscience into currency. Don't let anyone tell you that empathy is weakness. The moment you stop feeling, you stop fighting for what's right. Applause began, soft at first, then building. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned slightly forward, voice low again, intimate, as if speaking directly to every viewer at home. We can rebuild faith in justice. But it won't come from shouting matches or sound bites. It'll come from honesty, raw, uncomfortable honesty. The kind that holds even our own side accountable. That's the only way the law lives up to its name. The room erupted. Some stood, clapping. Others simply sat motionless, moved by something deeper than politics. Pam Bondi, still in her chair, looked down at her hands, fingers interlocked, knuckles pale. The camera zoomed in, capturing the glint of moisture gathering at the corner of her eye. She blinked it away quickly, but the moment was seen, raw, human, undeniable. The host turned toward her gently. Ms. Bondi, would you like to respond? She hesitated. The studio waited. For a heartbeat it seemed she might try to reclaim the stage. But then she only said, quietly, no, I think she's said enough. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of resignation. It wasn't defeat in the political sense. It was something heavier, more final, a realization. Crockett looked at her, not triumphantly, but respectfully. "Thank you," she said softly. The host closed the program with trembling formality. "This has been one of the most candid exchanges we've seen on this network. Thank you to both of our guests. Good night, America." The broadcast light blinked red, then faded to black. But even after the cameras shut off, the silence lingered. That charged, unforgettable silence that follows the truth when it's finally spoken aloud. Pam Bondi stayed seated, staring at the table, the hum of applause fading into the distance. Around her, crew members moved quietly, unsure whether to speak. Jasmine Crockett stood, gathered her things calmly, and walked offstage, not as a victor, but as a woman who had simply finished saying what needed to be said. Outside the studio, the night was cool and still. Reporters were already typing headlines, hashtags were already trending, but the story itself was simpler than all that. Pam Bondi had tried once more to corner Jasmine Crockett. But this time, Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She had dismantled the very foundation of Bondi's argument, piece by piece, until all that remained was silence and truth. And as the nation replayed the moment again and again, one thing became clear: it wasn't just the end of a debate. It was the end of an era, live, unedited, and unforgettable.